You know, I have spent the better part of my life watching people exhaust themselves in the most peculiar way. They worry about everything. They worry about what might happen, what should have happened, what others think is happening. And in all this worrying, they miss the one thing that could actually change their lives. They miss the present moment where life is actually occurring. I remember sitting with a patient many years ago, a successful businessman, who came to me because, as he put it, his life was falling apart. His marriage was strained, his children barely spoke to him, and despite his material success, he felt utterly empty. But what struck me most was not what he told me about his problems. It was how he told me every sentence was laced with anxiety about the future or regret about the past. He lived entirely in his head, in a world of worry that existed nowhere but in his own mind. "Dr. Jung," he said, "I cannot stop thinking about what will happen if my business fails, if my wife leaves me, if my children never forgive me." And I asked him a simple question that seemed to surprise him greatly. "But what is happening right now, in this very moment?" He looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Because you see, in that moment, nothing terrible was happening. He was sitting in a comfortable chair, breathing freely, speaking with someone who was listening. The catastrophes he feared existed only in his imagination. This is what I have come to understand about human suffering. Most of it is not caused by what actually happens to us. It is caused by what we think might happen, or what we believe should be happening instead of what is. We create elaborate mental prisons and then wonder why we feel trapped. But here is something remarkable that I have observed again and again in my work with people. The moment someone stops feeding their worries with attention, the moment they withdraw their energy from these mental phantoms, something extraordinary begins to occur. Life, which seemed so chaotic and unmanageable, starts to reorganize itself. Not because the external circumstances necessarily change immediately, but because their relationship to those circumstances transforms completely. You see, worry is not just a mental activity. It is an energy that radiates outward, affecting everything we touch. When we are consumed with anxiety about the future, we cannot be fully present to the opportunities that are right in front of us. We cannot listen properly to our loved ones because we are too busy rehearsing conversations that may never happen. We cannot make clear decisions because our minds are clouded with fears that may never materialize. I think of worry as a kind of psychic static that interferes with our natural ability to perceive what is actually needed in any given situation. Imagine trying to listen to beautiful music while someone is constantly shouting in your ear. This is what worry does to our consciousness. It drowns out the subtle signals that life is always sending us about which direction to move, what choice to make, how to respond. But when we stop worrying, when we learn to quiet this internal noise, we discover something that has been there all along. We discover that we possess a natural intelligence, a kind of inner knowing that is far more reliable than all our anxious planning and mental gymnastics. This is not mysticism. This is simply the recognition that consciousness, when it is not distorted by fear, has an extraordinary capacity to perceive what is actually happening and respond appropriately. Let me tell you about another patient, a young woman who came to me in a state of complete despair. She had been worrying obsessively about her future for years. Should she marry her boyfriend? Should she change careers? Should she move to another city? Every decision felt monumental, and the fear of making the wrong choice had paralyzed her completely. She spent hours each day analyzing every possible outcome, creating elaborate mental scenarios, seeking advice from everyone she knew. During our sessions, I noticed something interesting. Whenever she talked about her actual present experience, about what she was feeling or sensing right now, she became calm and articulate. But the moment she started discussing her future plans, her entire demeanor changed. She became agitated, confused, almost frantic. It was as if she were two different people. So I suggested an experiment. For 1 week, she would make no decisions about her future. Instead, she would simply pay attention to what was happening in her immediate experience. What did she enjoy? What gave her energy? What felt right in her body? What made her curious or excited? She resisted this idea at first. "But I need to plan," she protested. "I need to figure things out." And I told her something that seemed to shock her. "My dear, you have been planning and figuring for years, and where has it gotten you? Perhaps it is time to try something different. Perhaps it is time to trust that life itself has intelligence." What happened in that week was remarkable. Without the constant pressure to make decisions, without the endless mental churning about the future, she began to notice things she had never seen before. She discovered that she felt most alive when she was working in her garden. She realized that conversations with her boyfriend felt forced and draining, while conversations with a colleague at work left her feeling energized and inspired. She noticed that the city she lived in felt heavy to her, while visits to the countryside filled her with a sense of expansion. None of these observations came from thinking or analyzing. They came from simply being present to her actual experience. And based on these observations, the decisions she had been agonizing over began to make themselves, not through mental effort, but through a kind of natural unfolding, like a flower opening to the sun. This is what I mean when I say that when you stop worrying, everything starts to go well. I do not mean that external challenges disappear or that life becomes easy. I mean that you begin to align yourself with the natural flow of life rather than fighting against it. You begin to respond to what is actually happening rather than reacting to phantoms of your imagination. But why is this so difficult for us? Why do we cling to our worries even when they clearly cause us suffering? I believe it is because worry gives us the illusion of control. When we are planning obsessively, when we are anticipating every possible problem, we feel as though we are doing something important. We feel as though we are protecting ourselves from uncertainty. But this is a cruel deception. Worry does not give us control over life. It only gives us the exhausting task of trying to control the uncontrollable. And while we are busy with this impossible task, we miss the real opportunities for influence that exist in the present moment. We miss the chance to respond skillfully to what is actually before us. You see, life has its own intelligence. Not a personal intelligence that cares about your individual preferences, but a larger intelligence that knows how to grow a tree from a seed, how to heal a wound, how to balance the complex systems that keep us alive. When we align ourselves with this intelligence, rather than fighting against it with our anxious mental activity, we discover that we are part of something much larger and more trustworthy than our small, worried minds. This does not mean we become passive or irresponsible. It means we learn to distinguish between useful planning and useless worry, between appropriate caution and paralyzing fear. It means we develop the capacity to act when action is called for and to wait when waiting is what is needed. I have watched this transformation happen countless times. People who have spent years trapped in cycles of anxiety and mental struggle suddenly find themselves moving through life with a kind of grace they never knew they possessed. Not because their circumstances have become perfect, but because they have learned to trust something deeper than their surface fears. The businessman I mentioned earlier, after months of learning to quiet his worried mind, discovered that many of the problems he had been agonizing over simply resolved themselves. His relationship with his wife improved not because he found the perfect words to say, but because he learned to be present with her instead of lost in his anxious thoughts about their future. His children began to open up to him not because he figured out the right parenting strategy, but because they could feel that he was actually there with them, paying attention to who they really were. This is the paradox that most people cannot grasp. The more we try to control life through worry and mental effort, the more chaotic and unmanageable it becomes. But the more we learn to trust the natural intelligence that flows through us when our minds are quiet, the more harmonious and effortless life becomes. It is curious to me how we have developed this strange relationship with uncertainty. We speak of it as though it were an enemy to be defeated, a problem to be solved. Yet uncertainty is the very condition that makes growth possible. When everything is fixed and predictable, when we know exactly what will happen next, life becomes stagnant. It is only in the unknown that new possibilities can emerge. But we have convinced ourselves that we must know everything in advance. We must predict every outcome, control every variable, eliminate every risk. And so we spend our days in a futile battle against the fundamental nature of existence itself. We exhaust ourselves trying to make the uncertain certain, the unknown known. I have observed that this compulsive need for certainty often masks something much deeper. It masks our fear of our own power, our own capacity to respond creatively to whatever life presents. You see, if we truly trusted our ability to meet the unknown with wisdom and resourcefulness, we would not need to know everything in advance. We could walk into uncertainty with confidence, knowing that whatever arises, we have within us the capacity to respond appropriately. But somewhere along the way, we lost touch with this inner resourcefulness. We began to believe that our small, conscious minds must figure everything out, must plan for every contingency. We forgot that we are part of a larger intelligence that has been navigating uncertainty for millions of years. The heart knows when to beat faster and when to slow down without our conscious direction. The immune system knows how to respond to threats we have never encountered before. The creative mind knows how to find solutions to problems that have never existed. This same intelligence that governs our biological processes is available to guide us through the uncertainties of our daily lives. But we cannot access it while we are consumed with worry. Worry is like a loud noise that drowns out the subtle whispers of this deeper wisdom. It is only in moments of stillness, when the anxious mind finally quiets, that we can hear what this larger part of ourselves is trying to tell us. I remember working with a man who had been tormented by financial worries for years. He would lie awake at night calculating and recalculating his expenses, imagining scenarios of bankruptcy and ruin. His wife would find him at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, surrounded by papers and ledgers, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. What fascinated me about his case was that his actual financial situation was quite stable. Yes, he had debts, as most people do. Yes, there were uncertainties about the future, as there always are. But the catastrophes he imagined bore little resemblance to his actual circumstances. His worry had taken on a life of its own, feeding on itself, growing larger and more consuming with each passing day. During our work together, we discovered that his financial fears were connected to much deeper anxieties about his worth as a man, his ability to provide for his family, his sense of security in the world. The numbers on the ledger sheets were not really the problem. They were simply the screen onto which he projected his fundamental fear of not being enough, of not having enough, of not doing enough. When he began to understand this, something remarkable happened. He did not suddenly become wealthy. His debts did not magically disappear. But his relationship to his financial situation transformed completely. He stopped the obsessive calculating. He stopped the middle of the night worry sessions. Instead, he began to take practical, measured steps to improve his situation. He spoke honestly with his wife about their finances for the first time in years. He sought advice from people who actually knew about money rather than spinning in circles of his own imagination. And you know what? His financial situation did begin to improve. Not through worry, but through clear-headed action. Not through anxiety, but through presence and practical wisdom. The energy that had been trapped in endless mental loops became available for actual problem solving. This is what I have witnessed again and again. When people stop worrying, they do not become irresponsible or careless. They become more effective. They see their situations more clearly. They make better decisions. They take more appropriate action. It is as though the fog of anxiety lifts and they can finally see the landscape clearly for the first time. But there is something even deeper at work here. When we stop worrying, we stop trying to live our lives from our heads and begin to live them from our whole being. We stop treating life as a problem to be solved and begin to experience it as a mystery to be lived. We stop seeing ourselves as isolated individuals struggling against a hostile universe and begin to feel our connection to the larger web of existence. I have noticed that people who worry excessively often speak as though they were separate from life, as though life were something happening to them rather than something they are part of. They say things like, "Life is so difficult," or "Why is this happening to me?" They position themselves as victims of circumstances beyond their control. But when someone stops worrying, when they learn to be present to what is actually happening rather than lost in fantasies about what might happen, their whole relationship to existence shifts. They begin to feel themselves as participants in life rather than victims of it. They begin to sense that they are not separate from the forces that shape their experience, but intimately connected to them. This shift in perspective changes everything. When you feel yourself as part of the larger flow of life, you naturally begin to move in harmony with it rather than against it. You begin to trust that the same intelligence that governs the movement of the planets and the growth of flowers is also available to guide your personal journey. You begin to relax into the fundamental mystery of existence rather than exhausting yourself trying to solve it. I do not mean to suggest that this is easy. We live in times that seem to demand constant vigilance, endless planning, perpetual anxiety about the future. The pace of change in our modern world can be overwhelming. There are genuine challenges and real dangers that require our attention and response. But even in the midst of genuine difficulties, worry is not helpful. Worry is not the same as appropriate concern or practical planning. Worry is the mind spinning in circles, creating elaborate fantasies about disasters that may never occur, while missing the actual opportunities and challenges that are present right now. When we learn to distinguish between useful thinking and useless worry, we discover that most of our mental activity falls into the latter category. We discover that we spend enormous amounts of energy on problems that exist only in our imagination, while neglecting the real work that needs to be done in the present moment. The young woman I mentioned earlier, after that transformative week of not making decisions about her future, continued to live in this new way. She did not abandon all planning or become reckless. Instead, she learned to plan from a place of clarity rather than anxiety. She learned to make decisions based on what felt true and alive in the present rather than what seemed safest according to her fearful projections. Within 6 months, her entire life had reorganized itself around this new way of being. She ended the relationship that had been draining her energy. She changed careers in a direction that had never occurred to her anxious mind, but felt completely natural to her deeper wisdom. She moved to a small town where she felt she could breathe, where the pace of life allowed her to stay connected to the subtle signals of her inner guidance. To outside observers, these changes might have seemed sudden or even impulsive, but to her they felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was as though she had been holding her breath for years and was finally able to exhale. She had stopped fighting against her own nature and begun to trust the intelligence that had always been there, waiting patiently for her to listen. This is what happens when we stop worrying. We stop living our lives according to the fearful calculations of our anxious minds and begin to live them according to the deeper rhythms of our being. We stop trying to force outcomes and begin to allow life to unfold through us. We discover that we are not the small, isolated, vulnerable creatures we imagined ourselves to be, but expressions of something vast and intelligent and fundamentally trustworthy, worthy. And yet, I find myself wondering about something else entirely. There is a quality that emerges in people when they finally release their grip on worry, something I have noticed but rarely spoken of directly. It is as though they begin to emanate a different kind of presence, a stillness that others can feel even before a word is spoken. I recall a woman who came to see me after years of what she called living in her head. She was a teacher, intelligent and capable, but she had become so consumed with anticipating every possible classroom disaster, every potential parent complaint, every way her lessons might fail, that she had lost all joy in her work. The children, she told me, seemed restless and distant. Her colleagues avoided her. Even her own family found her difficult to be around. But what struck me most profoundly was not her story of anxiety, but what happened in the months that followed as she learned to inhabit the present moment. Her students began to respond differently to her presence, not because she had changed her teaching methods or learned new techniques, but because something fundamental had shifted in her way of being. She was no longer broadcasting that subtle frequency of worry the children, with their remarkable sensitivity, had been picking up and reflecting back to her. You see, we vastly underestimate the impact of our inner state on everything around us. We imagine that our private mental activities remain private, that our internal struggles are contained within the boundaries of our own consciousness. But this is not so. Worry creates a field around us, an atmosphere that others enter the moment they come into our presence. Think of how you feel when you are with someone who is deeply anxious, even if they are trying to hide it. There is a tension in the air, a subtle agitation that affects your own nervous system. You may find yourself becoming restless or uncomfortable without understanding why. The worried person's inner chaos becomes a kind of contagion, spreading invisibly to everyone in their vicinity. But the opposite is equally true, though far less commonly experienced in our time. When someone has truly learned to rest in the present moment, when they have released their mental grip on imaginary futures, they become a kind of sanctuary for others. Their presence alone becomes healing. Not because they are doing anything special, but because they are not doing the anxious, effortful things that most people do constantly. I have witnessed this phenomenon many times in my practice, and it never ceases to amaze me. A person learns to stop worrying, and suddenly Their marriage improves without their having to work on it consciously. Their children become more cooperative and affectionate. Their work relationships become more harmonious. Opportunities begin to appear as if from nowhere. This is not magic, though it may seem so to those who have never experienced it. It is simply the natural result of removing the interference that worry creates in the field of life around us. When we are not constantly broadcasting anxiety, when we are not perpetually preparing for disasters that exist only in our imagination, we become available to perceive and respond to the actual currents of life that are always flowing around us. I think of a merchant I knew, a man who had built a successful business through what he believed was careful planning and constant vigilance. He prided himself on anticipating problems, on having contingencies for every possible setback. But this vigilance had become a kind of torment. He could not enjoy his success because he was always preparing for its loss. He could not rest because there was always another potential disaster to consider. When he finally learned to release this compulsive planning, something extraordinary happened to his business. Not immediately, and not in ways he could have predicted through his anxious calculations. But gradually, organically, opportunities began to present themselves. New partnerships formed naturally. Creative solutions to old problems emerged without effort. His employees, no longer sensing his constant underlying tension, became more innovative and productive. What had changed? Not his business skills or his market knowledge. What had changed was his relationship to uncertainty. Instead of treating the unknown as an enemy to be defeated through mental preparation, he had learned to treat it as a creative space full of possibilities he could never have imagined. This shift from seeing uncertainty as threat to experiencing it as creative potential is perhaps the most profound transformation I have witnessed in people who learn to stop worrying. They discover that the future is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be entered with curiosity and trust. But let me speak more personally about this matter, for I have not always understood what I am telling you now. There was a period in my own life when I was consumed with worry about my work, my ideas, my place in the world of psychology. I would lie awake at night rehearsing arguments with colleagues who had criticized my theories. I would spend hours imagining scenarios where my ideas were rejected, where my reputation was destroyed, where everything I had worked for came to nothing. This mental activity felt important to me. I told myself I was being thorough, preparing for challenges, protecting my life's work. But what I was actually doing was living in a kind of mental prison, cut off from the very creative source that had given birth to my ideas in the first place. It was during this time that I began to pay attention to my dreams, not as a professional studying the unconscious, but as a human being seeking guidance for his own life. And what my dreams showed me was startling. They revealed that while my conscious mind was busy with its anxious preparations, my deeper self was already engaged in the next phase of my work, already moving toward insights and discoveries that my worried thoughts could never have planned. This taught me something crucial about the relationship between consciousness and creativity. The creative impulse, the source of genuine insight and innovation, cannot operate freely in an atmosphere of worry. It requires a kind of inner spaciousness, a willingness to not know, to be surprised, to allow something new to emerge. When I finally learned to trust this creative process, when I stopped trying to control the reception of my ideas and began to focus simply on expressing them authentically, something shifted in my entire relationship to my work. The very concerns that had been tormenting me began to resolve themselves naturally. Not because I had found clever strategies to address them, but because I was no longer feeding them with my attention and energy. This is something I want you to understand deeply, for it goes to the heart of human creativity and fulfillment. Every person carries within themselves a creative potential that is far more intelligent and resourceful than their conscious minds. This potential cannot be accessed through effort or worry. It can only be accessed through a kind of receptive attention, a willingness to listen to what wants to emerge from the depths of one's being. But we live in times that have forgotten this ancient wisdom. We have been taught to believe that everything must be achieved through conscious effort, through planning and striving and mental work. We have lost touch with the art of allowing, of creating space for the deeper intelligence of life to express itself through us. I have worked with many artists and writers who came to me in despair because their creative well had run dry. Invariably, I discovered that they had fallen into the trap of trying to create through worry. They were so concerned with producing something good, something that would be well received, something that would advance their careers, that they had lost contact with the spontaneous creative impulse that had originally drawn them to their art. The remedy was always the same, though it took different forms for different people. They had to learn to create without attachment to outcomes. They had to rediscover the joy of making something simply because it wanted to be made, without worrying about whether it would be successful or meaningful or properly understood. This principle applies far beyond the realm of art. It applies to every area of human endeavor. The parent who stops worrying about whether they are raising their children correctly and begins to trust their natural love and intuition. The entrepreneur who stops trying to control every variable in their business and begins to respond creatively to the opportunities that present themselves. The lover who stops analyzing their relationship and begins to simply love in each case. The shift is from effortful control to trusting receptivity, from mental manipulation to organic responsiveness, from trying to force life into predetermined patterns to allowing life to express its own intelligence through us. But this shift requires something that our culture has largely forgotten how to value: the capacity to be still, to wait, to listen to the subtle movements of life within us. We have become so addicted to mental activity, so convinced that we must always be doing something, thinking something, planning something, that we have lost the art of simply being present to what is. I often tell people that learning to stop worrying is like learning to stop holding your breath. You do not need to learn how to breathe, you only need to stop interfering with the natural breathing that is always trying to happen. Similarly, you do not need to learn how to live. You only need to stop interfering with the natural intelligence of life that is always trying to express itself through you. This natural intelligence is not something mystical or otherworldly. It is the same intelligence that beats your heart, that digests your food, that heals your wounds. It is the intelligence that dreams your dreams and inspires your insights and guides you toward the people and experiences that serve your deepest growth. But this intelligence operates according to its own rhythms, its own timing, its own mysterious logic. It cannot be commanded or controlled through worried thinking. It can only be trusted and followed, like following a stream that knows exactly where it is going, even when you cannot see the destination. I have watched people discover this trust, and it is always a beautiful thing to witness. There is a moment when something in them relaxes, when they stop trying so hard to figure everything out, when they allow themselves to be guided by something larger than their small, anxious minds. And In that moment, their whole life begins to reorganize itself around this new way of being. The businessman finds himself making decisions from a place of inner knowing rather than fearful calculation. The mother finds herself responding to her children with patience and wisdom rather than reactive anxiety. The artist finds ideas flowing through them without effort or strain. This is not passivity. This is not giving up responsibility for one's life. This is actually a much more active and engaged way of living. But it is activity that arises from depth rather than surface, from wisdom rather than worry, from trust rather than fear. And here's something else I have observed. When people learn to live this way, they become a source of peace and stability for everyone around them. Not because they have solved all their problems or eliminated all challenges from their lives, but because they have learned to meet whatever arises from a place of centered presence rather than anxious reactivity. In our troubled times, when so many people are consumed with worry about the future of the world, about the direction of society, about the countless problems that seem to have no solutions, this capacity to remain centered becomes not just personally valuable, but socially essential. The person who has learned to stop worrying becomes a kind of anchor point in the storm, a reminder that it is possible to remain human and responsive even in the face of uncertainty. This does not mean becoming indifferent to suffering or withdrawing from engagement with the world's problems. It means engaging from a place of clarity rather than chaos, from wisdom rather than worry, from love rather than fear. It means becoming part of the solution rather than part of the problem. For you see, worry is not just an individual affliction. It is a collective disease that spreads through communities, nations, entire civilizations. When enough people are consumed with anxiety about the future, when entire populations are living in a state of chronic worry, the result is not greater safety or security, but greater chaos and conflict. But the opposite is also true. When individuals learn to live from a place of trust and presence, they contribute something invaluable to the collective human condition. They become points of sanity in a world that often seems to have lost its mind. They demonstrate that it is possible to face uncertainty without panic, to encounter difficulty without despair, to live with hope even when the future cannot be guaranteed. This is perhaps the deepest reason why learning to stop worrying is so important. It is not just about personal peace or individual success. It is about becoming the kind of person that the world desperately needs right now. Someone who can remain calm in the storm, who can think clearly when others are consumed with fear, who can act with wisdom when others are paralyzed by anxiety. The transformation I am describing does not happen overnight. Like all genuine psychological change, it requires patience and practice, but it does happen. And when it does, it changes not just your own life, but the lives of everyone you touch. For in learning to stop worrying, you learn to trust life itself. And this trust becomes a gift you offer to the world simply by being who you are. But there is something else that happens when you learn to stop worrying. Something I have observed that goes beyond what most people understand about this transformation. When the mind finally quiets its anxious chatter, when it stops its compulsive rehearsing of imaginary conversations and catastrophic scenarios, a space opens up within you. And in this space you begin to hear things you have never heard before. I do not mean voices or mystical communications. I mean the subtle language of your own soul, the quiet wisdom that has been trying to reach you for years but could never get through the noise of your worried thoughts. This inner voice speaks in a different tongue than the mind. It does not argue or analyze or justify. It simply knows. I remember a woman who came to me in the grip of what she called the great paralysis. Every decision, from what to wear in the morning to whether to accept a marriage proposal, sent her into spirals of anxious deliberation. She would make lists of pros and cons, seek advice from every friend and family member, lie awake calculating probabilities and outcomes. Yet despite all this mental effort, she felt more confused and uncertain than ever. "Dr. Jung," she said, "I feel as though I am drowning in my own thoughts. The more I think, the less I understand. The more I plan, the more lost I become." And I told her something that seemed to startle her. "My dear woman, what if your problem is not that you think too little, but that you think too much? What if the very activity you believe will save you is the thing that is destroying your capacity to know what is right for you?" She looked at me as though I had suggested she stop breathing. Because in our time, we have made thinking into a kind of religion. We believe that every problem can be solved through mental effort, that every uncertainty can be resolved through analysis, that every decision can be perfected through careful calculation. But what I have discovered in my work with the human psyche is quite the opposite. The more we think about certain kinds of questions, the more confused we become. There are decisions in life that cannot be made by the rational mind because they involve aspects of our being that reason cannot touch. Should you marry this person? Should you have children? Should you pursue this calling? These are questions that reach into the very core of who you are, into regions of the soul that speak in feelings and intuitions and sudden knowings that arrive like gifts from the depths. But when we are consumed with worry, when our minds are churning constantly with anxious thoughts, we cannot hear these deeper messages. It is like trying to listen for a whisper in the middle of a thunderstorm. The subtle voice of inner knowing is drowned out by the noise of mental activity. This woman, after months of learning to quiet her worried mind, made a discovery that changed her entire relationship to decision-making. She discovered that she had always known what was right for her, not in her head, but in her body, in her heart, in some deeper place that recognized truth when it encountered it. The marriage proposal that had been tormenting her with indecision. Her body had been trying to tell her for months that something was wrong. The career change she had been analyzing endlessly. Her soul had been pulling her in a clear direction all along, but she had been so busy thinking about these things that she had never stopped to feel them, to sense what they stirred in the depths of her being. When she finally learned to be still, when she stopped the compulsive mental activity and simply sat with these questions in silence, the answers arose naturally, not as thoughts, but as recognitions, as certainties that came from a place deeper than the mind. This is one of the great secrets that our age has forgotten. We have become so identified with our thinking minds that we have lost touch with the other forms of intelligence that live within us. We have forgotten that the heart has its own kind of knowing, that the body carries its own wisdom, that the soul speaks in its own mysterious language. But when you stop worrying, when you learn to be present to what is actually happening within you, rather than lost in fantasies about what might happen around you, you begin to rediscover these other ways of knowing. You begin to sense that you are not just a thinking machine trapped in a physical body, but a complex being with many different sources of intelligence and guidance. I have seen people make this discovery and watch their entire lives transform as a result. Not because they suddenly became smarter or more capable, but because they began to access forms of wisdom they had always possessed but never learned to trust. They began to make decisions from their whole being rather than just their anxious minds. They began to move through life with a kind of integrated intelligence that was far more effective than all their worried planning had ever been. But there is a paradox here that must be understood. This deeper intelligence, this inner knowing, only becomes available when we stop trying so hard to access it. It is like trying to see your reflection in water that you keep stirring with your hand. The more you disturb the surface, the more distorted the image becomes. But when you finally stop stirring, when you allow the water to become still, the reflection appears clearly on its own. This is why worry is so counterproductive when it comes to navigating the important questions of life. Worry is a form of mental stirring that prevents us from seeing clearly what is actually there. It creates disturbance in the very medium through which deeper wisdom tries to communicate with us. I think of a young man I worked with who had been agonizing for years about his calling in life. He was intelligent and talented, with interest in many different directions, but he could not settle on a path forward. Every possibility he considered seemed to have fatal flaws. Every choice seemed to close off other options he was not ready to abandon. He had become paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong decision, of wasting his potential, of disappointing the people who had invested in him. What I discovered in working with him was that his paralysis was not really about external choices at all. It was about an internal split, a war between different aspects of himself that he had never learned to integrate. Part of him wanted security and approval. Another part craved adventure and creativity. Part of him felt obligated to follow the path his family expected. Another part yearned to break free from all expectations and discover something entirely his own. His worried mind had been trying to find a single choice that would satisfy all these different aspects of himself simultaneously. But this was impossible, and the attempt to do so had trapped him in endless circular thinking that led nowhere. What he needed was not a better decision-making process, but a deeper understanding of who he actually was beneath all these conflicting desires and expectations. When he finally stopped trying to think his way to a solution and began to explore these different aspects of himself with curiosity rather than judgment, something remarkable happened. He discovered that what he had been experiencing as paralysis was actually the beginning of a more complex and mature way of being. He began to understand that he did not have to choose between his different impulses, but could find ways to honor them all in a life that was richer and more multifaceted than any single career path could provide. This integration did not happen through mental analysis, but through a kind of inner dialogue, a process of getting to know the different voices within himself and learning to orchestrate them into a harmonious whole. And this process only became possible when he stopped the anxious mental spinning and created space for these deeper conversations to occur. This is what I mean when I speak of the intelligence that emerges when worry subsides. It is not the intelligence of the calculating mind, but the intelligence of the whole person, the wisdom that arises when all aspects of our being are allowed to contribute to our understanding of what we need and where we are meant to go. But I must tell you something about this process that may surprise you. This deeper intelligence does not always lead us toward what we think we want. In fact, it often guides us in directions that our conscious minds would never have chosen, toward experiences that may seem difficult or challenging or contrary to our immediate preferences. I remember a successful lawyer who came to me because he had begun to feel a profound emptiness in his professional life, despite achieving everything he had once thought he wanted. He had money, status, respect, security. Yet he felt as though he were sleepwalking through his days, going through the motions of a life that no longer held any meaning for him. As we explored his situation, it became clear that his career choice had been driven largely by worry, by the desire to create security and avoid the uncertainties that come with following one's authentic calling. He had chosen law not because it inspired him, but because it seemed safe, predictable, likely to provide the kind of stable life that would protect him from the chaos he feared. But what he discovered as he learned to quiet his worried mind was that this very attempt to avoid uncertainty had led him into a kind of spiritual death. He had traded aliveness for security and found that the bargain had impoverished him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The deeper intelligence that emerged as his anxiety subsided began to guide him toward possibilities that his fearful mind would have rejected immediately. He found himself drawn to teaching, to working with children, to activities that paid far less than his legal practice, but filled him with an energy and enthusiasm he had not felt in years. His worried mind protested violently against these impulses. What about his mortgage? What about his retirement savings? What about the respect and status he had worked so hard to achieve? But something deeper in him recognized that these concerns, while practical, were not the most important considerations for a life well lived. Something in him knew that he would rather face financial uncertainty while doing work that mattered to him than continue accumulating money while his soul withered from neglect. The transition was not easy. There were moments of doubt and fear. There were practical challenges to navigate. But what sustained him through this difficult period was the recognition that he was finally moving in the direction his deeper nature had been trying to guide him all along. He was finally living from his authentic self rather than his frightened self. This is something I want you to understand about the intelligence that emerges when worry subsides. It is not interested in keeping you safe in the way your anxious mind defines safety. It is interested in keeping you alive in the deepest sense of that word. It knows that a life lived in service to fear is not really a life at all, but a kind of prolonged dying. This deeper intelligence will sometimes ask you to take risks that your worried mind cannot understand. It will sometimes guide you toward experiences that require you to grow in ways that feel uncomfortable or challenging. It will sometimes lead you away from what others expect of you and toward what your soul is calling you to become. But here is what I have observed in every person who has learned to trust this deeper guidance. Even when the path becomes difficult, even when there are setbacks and challenges, there is a quality of aliveness, of meaning, of rightness that sustains them through whatever difficulties arise. They may not have the kind of security that money can buy, but they have something far more valuable. They have the security that comes from knowing they are living in alignment with their authentic nature. And so, my friend, we come to the heart of it all. When you finally learn to stop worrying, you discover that you have been carrying within yourself all along everything you need to navigate this mysterious existence. Not the anxious calculations of a frightened mind, but the quiet wisdom of a soul that knows how to live. The businessman found peace with his family. The young woman discovered her path. The lawyer rediscovered meaning. Each of them stopped fighting against life and began to dance with it instead. This is what awaits you when you release your grip on imaginary futures and embrace the only moment that has ever existed, this one, right here, right now. Trust this. Life knows what it is doing, even when you do not. Your deepest intelligence is already guiding you toward everything you need. Stop the mental noise and listen. The answer you seek is not in your worried thoughts, but in the stillness between them, waiting patiently for you to remember who you really are.